Okay, so hi, I'm Dan Turner. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. I'm also the deputy of Shaare Zedek for R&D. With me, we will talk in a tandem talk with Dr. Amir Jarjoui, who is a senior physician for internal medicine, and he's the medical officer that escorts this project that we are offering you to take part and to have your test your skills in, because this is a real question for us, and we are progressing this this analysis to develop an AI, the first in Israel for sure, maybe first in the world hospital to have this system to prioritize the labs in our patients. Okay, so we can use AI and big data on our administrative databases for developing tools to aid physicians, but also to address all kinds of medical questions of interventions, of effectiveness. And many of them, my PhD is in clinical epidemiology, and many of my colleagues say that administrative databases for addressing these questions is totally wrong, because there are so many biases in addressing questions of medicine, medical questions in observational data, that it will be impossible really to conclude solid conclusions about how to treat our patients. I give them this example as a reply. And this example is about, it comes from cardiology. In 2005 there was an earthquake, and many cardiothoracic surgeons thought they're going to lose their job and all wards are going to be closed. There were two very large meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials showing that catheterization, cardiac catheterization and stenting by cardiologists was superior than surgery and bypass. And not only it was superior, that there were less mortality and the outcomes and the safety was better. So it made a big issue, big deal. I'm showing you only one of the second meta-analysis. But then later that year came a large study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing that for those who are sicker, those who have 3-vessel disease and more complicated disease, then surgery was superior to stenting. And why was that not shown in the meta-analysis? Because randomized controlled trial typically take only 10% of the population, and this 10% is very biased, and it's biased because they are always part of tertiary academic centers and not from the community, and also biased because they are often led by industry, and industry would like eligibility criteria that removes the more difficult cases to show, well, one reason is safety, the other reason is obvious, they want to show that their product works. And then what happens that we get a very pure effect of what we tested in a prospective study, but it's not representative of the population. And now it's very clear that the milder case go to the cardiologist, the more severe case goes to the surgeons, and this border changes as technology improved. But the surgeon will reassure that they can earn their living for the rest of their career as well. The problem is about administrative databases is that we are not using it enough, and because there are many barriers to how to use the data, sharing biases, phenotyping the data. I'm sure all of you are aware of all these problems. This is an example of Israel. Israel is quite high on the list of availability of data because of central computerization of the health maintenance organizations. But we are very poor in utilizing the data for research and for innovation. And you can see this gap, that's what we're trying to bridge on the everyday efforts. So if we want to use the all relevant population, that seems like very nice in the cartoon. So we're taking all the population, there are no biases whatsoever, but the truth is there are. Because when you're taking the data, it's not always the data that you are actually meaning to take. And if you're not aware of the depth of the data and the meaning of the data, you won't know even to ask the questions of what is our data. So patients, companies come to us, for instance, in Shaare Zedek, they want data on pneumonia. All patients that were received, that were diagnosed with hospital-acquired pneumonia in the ICU between dates that and that. And we asked them, how do you define the pneumonia? I said, well, pneumonia is pneumonia. He said, yeah, but is that by codes? Is that by X-ray? Is that by blood? Do you need all of them? Do you need half of them? Like, pneumonia is not pneumonia. What are you asking, really? And they can, I don't know, we just need pneumonia. And this is part of the discussion that we need to do in order to define our population in a better way. And if you get the data from different sources and different tables, even within the same organizations, then you get different definition altogether, and then it's really a big jungle of data that is not standardized. And this is what Amir and I are trying to do with this project, to try to link the data science and the phenotype of the data to the clinical questions in order to get like the most sharp algorithm to address the question that we are trying to have. I'll give you one example from my research of big data. We have a server at Shaare Zedek that have all the data ever registered on all inflammatory bowel disease patients in Israel since 2000, Crohn's and colitis, plus match control. So we have all data ever recorded on 250,000 patients, 55,000 IBD patients, and the rest on controls from the 4 HMOs and from the National Registry of the Ministry of Health. So when we had to develop the algorithm to identify these patients, so we went to validation. We took 40,000 patients from each, or subjects from each of the HMOs, and we had chart reviews from all of them that were coded as IBD, not suspected, not ruled out. They were coded as IBDs. Many of them actually received treatments that may have been associated with IBD, and we found, as we found before, that 1/3 of patients that are registered in the HMOs as having IBD did not have IBD. And well, then you need to develop the algorithm to find the patient. There's always sensitivity, specificity, and predictive value, which are different between the algorithm. We'll talk about it in the end, the difference and why it's so important in medical questions, as you are going to look in your exercise now, to look at predictive value and not at sensitivity, specificity, and certainly not at p-values. So we need, when we get all the data sets, we need to standardize the languages. I'm not going to talk about here, not FHIR, not other ways of doing it, so you know it all, but there are different ways that you need to think about in your exercise. When you get all the data, how do you want to standardize it between the wards and between pediatric and adults and the different populations, so your algorithm is applicable for everyone. If the algorithms is heavily weighted on your data set on CRP, for instance, and then for some reason in some wards they don't send CRP just because I don't know why, and you won't have the background of CRP, then something is going to be missing in the overall algorithm. So we need to think about how to standardize the data on the different sets that we are training our models, and then to validate it in different ways, because on observational data, as you know, nothing is standardized. I'm not going to talk that. There's so much to talk about standardization of data, but Michal told me that you know it all, so I shouldn't go into it, so that's it. So I'm going to ask Amir here to go into a little bit more on the medical side of the research question, and then we can wrap up with understanding specifically about the research question.
But let's make sure that if people have questions, so I don't...
Oh, in the end. Okay. There's really loud time.
Thank you, Professor Turner. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the medical aspect of it. So usually the diagnostic process starts when the patients interact with the healthcare system because they are having some concerns or symptoms, right? So the physicians then take medical history, physical examination, start collecting data, and an important thing that we use on daily basis is lab tests. So in many instances we order lab tests, and once we order a lab test, the whole new process comes to life. The physician puts in the order, The lab test blood is drawn by the phlebotomist, gets sent to the lab. They do the required tests. The results are sent back. Physicians interpret the results and then decide on a treatment together with the patient. And this process goes over and over every time we order a blood test. So really, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes when ordering a blood test. Now, we do not only use blood tests to confirm a diagnosis based on a new symptom. We use also blood tests as screening tests, even if we do not have any symptoms. For example, PSA levels, which is a marker for prostate cancer above a certain age, TSH levels for screening for thyroid problems, also in certain populations, bilirubin levels in neonates, and there are endless examples of that. So we use it also to investigate new symptoms. We also use it as a screening test, even if there is no symptom. We also use blood tests to monitor response to treatment to see if the disease is getting better or worse. We also use the blood test sometimes to look for complications of our treatment, our medication that we are giving, and to rule out other diagnoses, even if they seem medically less likely. A lot of instances we need to make sure that it's not something else. So really there are a lot of indications for blood tests, and there are a lot of different scenarios, endless basically. So what's the problem? Because lab tests are so valuable to us, they are so readily available, they are so informative, we tend to overuse them. And when we ask physicians, this is from the States, what are the major causes that you order a blood test? Many of the physicians say because of malpractice concerns, just to be on the safe side, just want more information. So basically, not really medically warranted. Now, being on the safe side is always good. You do not want to miss anything. That's for sure something good. But again, the line is not really clear, and we tend to overuse tests. So if you ask physicians on what basis or how frequent do you order unnecessary tests, so a lot of them say we order unnecessary tests 2-3 times a week, if not daily. So we know we have a problem. We are addicted to lab tests. So really, this problem is real, and we know it's there. When you ask residents, this is another paper from the States, about how many or what's the frequency of ordering unnecessary blood tests, 82% of them, in this example only 116 residents answered, but 82% of them say that they do ask for unnecessary routine blood tests. And why do you do that? When you ask, why are you requiring these tests? A lot of the time it's just because that's what they are used to. They think the attending might want their test results just to be sure, feeling unconfident. So really a huge chunk of this is really not based on accurate medical reasoning. So it is a real problem. So the impact of taking unnecessary or ordering unnecessary blood tests can cause major harm to the patients, both physically and psychologically. It increases the workload significantly for the people who are taking the blood test, interpreting the results, the lab workers, all the system. Mismanaged time, because we are trying to interpret the results that we did not need in the first place. And obviously, a waste of resources, a huge waste of resources, because even if a single blood test is not that expensive, when you order thousands, millions over time, it gets, yes?
Just to be very accurate, what do you mean by unnecessary test? Is it a test that...
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Oh, you have it.
Mm-hmm. So it's really, that's a very good question, and that's one of the problems, because we do not always know what an unnecessary test is. So we're going to get to that after. So this problem is not only in the United States. I only brought a few examples from other countries, but It's all over the world. So this is a paper from the Netherlands stating the same problem of inappropriate laboratory testing. Canada, same thing. Australia. So basically, it's all over, right? So what's going on in Shaare Zedek? I brought a few examples. So if we look at, let's say, white blood cell count, and the amount or the average tests that were done per day for different departments, here we have in blue is internal medicine A, B, C. It doesn't really matter which department, but the thing is, if we look at the amount of tests were ordered per day as a factor of the days, total days of admission, we see that in the people who were admitted for 4 or 5 days usually undergo at least one, if not two, sometimes even 3 tests per day, right? Of the same thing, of the same test, the white blood cell count. And if when you take a look about on patients who were admitted for 20 days, the number drops at about 0.7 tests per day, but it really plateaus, so there is no decline after that. Still, it does not mean that these tests are not necessary or not warranted. So when you go through the details and try to look at examples from the patients who are admitted, now this is an example from one patient from the internal medicine department who was admitted, in this case was pneumonia, but basically in July they started, for some reason, they decided to take a liver function test, which is a few blood results together. We'll talk about that after. But basically they tested for liver functions on the 26th, on 27th, 28th, 29th, 31st, basically 5 times or 4 times in sequence, always normal. So this is obviously unnecessary. Now, sometimes it's not that obvious. That's why we need a smarter solution. But certain things are obvious.
I mean, if this is, for example, a fresh liver transplant, then clearly, even if it's great, there is the risk that it will turn.
Yes, in this case it wasn't. It was a pneumonia. Okay. So again, the devil is in the details. So
no, I'm saying just for
every test has its own time and indications for sure, but a lot of times, as we also, physicians say on themselves, we order unnecessary blood tests.
Yeah,
so
but I think that self-reporting physicians saying it's unnecessary, not necessarily is the accurate mathematical definition of unnecessary. So let's say there's a probability of 1 to 1,000 that something comes up in the test, and it's of importance, you would act upon it. If a physician did 200 times a test, he never saw a positive result, it was always negative, the physician might say, this is unnecessary, but someone without the human bias, thinking about the likelihood of finding something and how important it is to find it, would have made a different judgment. So the self-reporting physician, these are human beings, right? They are biased, they see 2 weeks in a row that nothing came up, they might jump to a conclusion like every human being. So that's why I asked what's the formal definition, because if you say there are tests that no matter what the result, there's no action that you can draw from it, that's unnecessary by definition. If you say there are tests that the likelihood of something coming up is very low, but if it comes up, it's very important, then I need a definition. What's the likelihood that you, upon it, you would like to test? And if it's 1 in a million, you would not test, but if it's 1 in 1,000, you would like to have the test.
The last few slides are exactly on these questions. So let's wait.
I wanted to support Meir.
But this is bang on the nail. This is exactly the issues that we are discussing in the last 2 or 3 months on the.
So this is another example from the surgery department. In this example, it was a case of admission because of acute cholecystitis, so an infection of the gallbladder, and they took liver function tests every day, which is fine, but in the same time, they are taking chloride, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, which does not really have any cause for it, also on daily basis. So another example is from pediatrics, but maybe we should give some more time for the question, so I'm gonna go faster now. So again, blood tests that are basically not warranted when you go through the file and see that these tests were uncalled for, just a habit. So basically, we have a worldwide problem all over the world. All the countries are suffering from it. It concerns all disciplines, also the ambulatory care, but also the hospitals, even more so in the hospitals than the ambulatory care, and it has major impacts on the healthcare systems. So what are the solutions? So a few things were tried, right? So I'm gonna go through these, a few of them. So cost transparency is something that has been tried in a lot of instances. We also have this here in Israel. So some of the Kupat Cholim show you the cost of each test that you are ordering in a way to increase awareness about maybe you're ordering too much, and it does help a little bit, but it does not, it does not solve the whole problem. After a while, physicians tend to not look at these numbers. It's not really accurate, and so it does maybe help for a few percent, but does not solve the whole problem. Increasing the mindfulness and behind ordering blood tests, obviously it's a very attractive solution. Awareness, mindfulness, training. This is very time consuming. All the time we have new trainees. All the time there is inflow of new workforce, and this is not sustainable on the long run, and also has only mild effects. Administrative interventions of several causes. This is from Hadassah, and so the same thing. These solutions give only mild improvement in the amount of blood tests ordered, and it's only temporary. After a while, you get used to those, and the effects are no longer there. Using different algorithms for each blood test. So this is endless, right? So each blood test has several indications, a huge amount of medical scenarios. So you can do that for one or two blood tests that are very rare to use, but on daily basis this is not effective, and you cannot expect the staff to know all these different algorithms. So this is also apparently not a solution. So recently there have been a few articles about using a computerized clinical decision support system, which one of the reasons that we are here, and it's showing very good, promising results. I'm not gonna go through the actual article itself, but if we want to think about the solution and to think about what we would want in an AI system, ideally what we would have is an intelligent system that can, in real time, take into consideration all the medical data that is available in the electronic health record, and once the staff is trying to, is ordering a new blood test, take into consideration all the data available and either predict that the test is warranted or approve the test, or maybe ask for a reconsideration if the system identifies a low yield test. Maybe after validation we can add another level to that, meaning if we are sure that the system works, maybe then instead of asking for a reconsideration, we might ask for a consult with a senior physician or the attending, which usually have more experience and probably has a different insight. But the system, it's crucial that is a self-learning system, because all the time it will have input from the departments, from the physicians, why I do need this test, although you predicted it's low value or low effect. So it really needs to be a self-learning AI. So I'm gonna ask Professor Turner to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. So this is what you were asking. So we were really struggling in the last couple of months how to tag our data. So the first hunch that we had, that we are looking for to predict normal tests, right? I mean, that's what those who are normal are redundant and may not be necessary. There are two issues here. One is what is normal, and two, the yield of a normal test does not mean that it was not necessary. As Michal said, if I have someone going to a liver biopsy, for instance, if I'm taking for my field of expertise, then I cannot predict the ones that are going to bleed after the biopsy. No, I cannot predict, and the system cannot predict based on what we have, because the needle could have gone here or could go here, and no one can know that. And we need hemoglobin right after the procedure, even if that patient had like 20 normal tests before and everything seems okay. And the fact that only 1 in 200 will have an abnormal hemoglobin after the biopsy is still okay, because you do not want to miss that one patient that had bleeding. So the normal is not necessarily unnecessary. So we switch gears, and perhaps we need to predict abnormal tests. And if we know at that scenario for the patient that underwent liver biopsy that he or she going to have a abnormal hemoglobin, then maybe the system knows how to tag that specific patients and say, even after liver biopsy, this test is going to be relevant only to half of the patient that underwent liver biopsy, because we didn't recognize at all for this sort of population or algorithm that bleeding was available, occurred after liver biopsy. And then we reduce into half in that specific scenario. But then you will have to have a good knowledge of all the data in the data warehouse, not only the ones that had abnormal tests prior to the abnormal, because you would need to know, for instance, that a patient that is going now to surgery or going now to biopsy, the algorithm will allow that test regardless. Maybe that's in the first stage. In the second stage, maybe even for these patients, it will find those that are more likely or less likely to undergo to bleed after the procedure. But we have to. And then obviously we need the validation of the algorithm. It's going to be initial one, and then we're going to see specifically patient chart in one department to see how it goes, and then we will allow for the first run, as Amir showed you, to ask you to allow the physician ordering the test. Are you sure you want to order it? And he can say yes, or she can say yes, and the system therefore must be a deep learning system that can teach itself with the feedback from the physician. So if physician overrides the decision of the algorithm needs to understand why that happened and to train itself in a better way. So we discussed surgery, we discussed bleeding. Sometimes it's just improvement. If a patient have thalassemia, for instance, thalassemia is low hemoglobin. So the algorithm will detect that patient as an abnormal hemoglobin. Maybe the code of thalassemia will be apparent in the diagnosis, and the algorithm will know that, and therefore will know that that's okay, and maybe not. Maybe someone forgot to put thalassemia. And after 3 times, you will find low hemoglobin. How does your algorithm going to address issues that you have abnormal tests, but they are very stable for a long period of time? Are we going to change that? A patient that having normal tests, but is starting total parental nutrition. Total parental nutrition every day. You need to start electrolyte testing to see that it's within the normal range. So you'll need to know these details, the clinical data, in order to understand the value of the test, rather than just understanding what happened prior to the within the specific blood test that you're looking for. Time frame. We need to think, what is the time frame that lagged from the previous test? Albumin, for instance, takes a long time to change. So if you have albumin now, even if it's abnormal, 2.4, very little sense in repeating that after a day or two, because it's not going to change very rapidly. So you need to know what you are focusing. You need to know the test that you're going to focus. We're going to help you. And well, there's Google, but we can help you as well to understand which test you want to look at. However, for instance, if someone had infusion of albumin and you're going to have access to all the medication data as well in the order within the data warehouse, perhaps then it's okay to repeat the albumin because the patient just was treated with albumin and you want to know where that came to. And we don't want to be pushed into a corner that is say if and then. So it needs to be a comprehensive, because as Amir said, it's endless opportunities and possibilities within the data warehouse. Yes.
Is it okay to go now back to the definition of unnecessary test? So if you go to the slide, you have normal prediction versus abnormal prediction. I think that what you described after this slide was the specifics of the medical understanding, as you say, time, frame, and so on. But if you want to design a data-driven study that would apply to the whole thing, I would like to suggest an approach that says, you would like to do a prediction algorithm that says, given all the history and given all the tests that were taken now, I pull one test out and I ask, how well can I predict the result of that test? Never mind if it's normal or abnormal. Now, if you are able to predict it in a very high precision, very high precision, then you say, even if it's normal, if it's abnormal, you know what would happen. It's 99, I don't know, area under the curve. I mean, not area under the curve because you want to have to be in a specific region, but you say if it's very accurate, then you don't need a test because you know almost surely what would be the result, and then you need to validate it and look at the test. But I will do the prediction of outcome, normal or abnormal, clustering of all the tests for whom the prediction was extremely accurate, and clustering them to enable a human view on what characterizes those that you can very accurately predict. It's not going to be always the same test. You want to look at it. And that would identify for you those that are very rare results are not what you expect. So this, and then you would need to do the human judgment on if it's very accurate because it's 1 in 200 times, but it's still very important. I would not judge this as unnecessary test. But if it's very unlikely, it doesn't cover the case where, and I saw that a lot in the medical practice, I guess in Israel and any other place. I was sometime with a relative who had something in the, riding a bike, got something in their chest. So they went through x-ray. And there was a disagreement between the radiologist and the physician whether it's a Zedek or Shaare, broken or a fracture. And I was like, okay, what would you do if it's a fracture and what would you do if it's broken? They do the same. So they didn't even need to have the x-ray. But it took me a while when I went home and I tried to go through the whole process in my head. I think the code is different and the reimbursement is different. That's why they cared about this specific thing. But I believe there are many such cases where you do a test and the answer doesn't matter. You don't do anything. So in these cases, you would not be able to do it with AI if you don't design something that asks about the action following the test.
Yeah. Because the answer of the test is in the data, but the decision process.
So I think the beauty of the developing the, and thank you for interesting comments. I think you're highlighting things that we not necessarily thought about, and it's interesting. So you can take this forward. So I'm putting a lot of questions here because it's for you guys to think about how you want to approach this question. And for the training, you get the data set of the patients throughout the medical history. So you know what happened to that patient. You know each time what was the next blood test and what was the action after that, and whether this patient died or was discharged and when he was discharged after the test. So you can, in your validation and training of your algorithm, you can look at what happened to that patient as you just said. Now, then we're going to apply to real-time data. We still don't know the prognosis of that patient, but we can, in the first validation stage, we're going to look at it in the department. I would like to highlight the difference between sensitivity and specificity. This is something that people don't always acknowledge. I'll give you an example of celiac disease. So celiac disease has a very good serum marker called TTG. It's very accurate. It has a 95% sensitivity, 95% specificity. I'm giving you an example, a real example of 10,000 people here in Israel. Celiac is about 1% of the population, so you can calculate quickly to see that the numbers are real. Okay? So we have very common disease, subtle, very accurate, non-invasive test, and a disease that have good treatment, and if you don't treat it, then the outcome is poor. So why aren't we going to screen all the population for celiac at the age of 5, 4, 6? I mean, it has all the relevant points for a screening test. It has accurate, non-invasive, easy, cheap test. Many of the patients go asymptomatic, significant good treatment, and significant outcomes or grave outcome if not treated. Well, the reply to that is in the predictive value. What is the negative predictive value? It's almost 100, right? I mean, it's 99.999, right? What is the positive predictive value?
1, yes.
Why?
Sensitivity and specificity is not the whole picture.
Why? Tell me why.
You're missing one more
Why?
statistic.
What is the difference? Why is that 99.99 was 16%?
Depends on the prevalence in the population.
That's right. That's the only way. Because when you come to sensitivity, you mean that I know that you have the condition. What is the likelihood for the test or the algorithm to be positive? Who cares about that? No one, because it's irrelevant. If I know that you have the condition, I don't need an algorithm, right? So it's irrelevant. And you might be one in a million that have the condition, and still I know you have the condition, so now I'm looking at the algorithm. I don't care that you are 1 in 1 million because I don't have the 1 million here, I have only you. The predictive value is a different one. Algorithm is positive, what is the likelihood that you have the condition? Now this is what we're looking at in our data. This is what we need in your algorithm. I don't want the other way around. I don't want sensitivity and specificity. We don't need odds ratio. We don't need p-values. We need predicting value. And this is the difference between just statistics and medical statistics. Because in the end of the day, when we are looking for a test, you need to see within the data the prevalence of the abnormal test. It could be something really, really rare. And if it's really, really rare, your positive predictive value will be very low, or negative. It doesn't matter how you look, or is it really frequent? Depends on what you're looking. You're looking at the abnormal, the normal, or what do you want to predict. So look at what is the prediction, look at prediction values, and you need to also to consult about the probability. So this is going to be a long process, and in order to make, I don't think in this course, in this few days, you need to go into that, but just consider one more complexity, that in the lab, some labs go into bulk. So if you want, for instance, you want 1 or you want hemoglobin, you get all this. It doesn't matter. You cannot just say, oh, hemoglobin, but white blood cells, you don't need it. But if you choose something in CBC, complete blood count, you get the full Monty. And you need to treat some of these blood tests as a bulk or as a cluster within your algorithm. So the liver function test that Amir showed you, for instance, is one bulk, clotting factor is one bulk, CBC is one bulk, sodium and potassium is one bulk, but other electrolytes are not.
3 minutes?
Yeah, no, we finished. That's the last slide. So what do I recommend, what we recommend you to do is first, guys here and Eli's here, they know the data, they know the question. We sat between us many times, and you can consult with them. Amir kindly gave you the cell phone number. You can WhatsApp him, you can call him. He won't be here throughout the course, but more than happy.
Maybe we should write it on the board, because the slide will go down.
I'm very happy to I'm very happy also to return after whenever to consult with us. We can discuss it. We advise you to start with one test. Take one test. Don't take the whole Monty. Take sodium, potassium. Take CBC. CBC is complicated, so take something which is easy. Take calcium. Take bilirubin. Take something which is one and it's more easier to look out. Think about the different scenarios of utilizing the test. So first, in the descriptive analysis, look at the cases within the data that you have abnormal tests then. And what are these abnormal tests in relation to other places? Were these related to different codes or different medications or different procedures that these patients were going out? So when you understand the relationship between the data fields, then you can more going to dive into the understanding of what the data is or are plural for you. You have it all in your thing. You might want to train or to explore your data in pediatric, adult, and elderly in a different way. So pediatricians often have different way of addressing their patients. They have different diseases. There are different values of what is normal, abnormal. There are different physiology. You might see that an algorithm that works well in the pediatric population, you will need a different algorithm for adults and different for elderly as well. You might different type of wards. So internal medicine is all internal medicine, but you might see that ICU, intensive care units, they treat their patient differently because it's so rapidly changing the physiology within the ICU. You might need or just to exclude them from your algorithm, just do what you want. So emergency room and ICU, just do whatever you do anyway. Let's focus on patients that are admitted in the internal ward. You might want to do a subgroup analysis in the beginning to start to understanding of your patients. We are very happy to liaise with you, and you have good ideas. And if after the course you want to continue working with us on this, we are very open. We are going to make this happen. We understand that this is a long process, and we understand that the first algorithm that will be low maybe only on some tests, and maybe we will have very accurate it will be very accurate. It will not exclude many patients, but those who are going to include they're going to be accurate, and only gradually when we have more confidence we will work our way up. But this is a process already started, and we invite you to be part of it. Thank you very much.
Okay. We had kind of back and forth with questions, so unless there's a burning question, so a few comments. One is some of the talks, like Chris's talk, I think, is going to touch on relevant things, and tomorrow, almost a nice talk is going to be also very relevant to blood testing, what we're looking at. So the theme will return throughout the course. Second, we will try to be available either during the lunch break or during after the last session for people who want to do brainstorming or on what they can do with the data. And so if you want to say, I have an idea and I don't know what to do, and we'll try to get to see if we can help or confuse you even more, whatever. And we'll try at the end of the class, the course, if there will be interest. I think Shaare Zedek people are interested to do kind of a wrap up what did we learn from this attempt. It's clear that during a very busy week with all those lectures, we are not going to solve all problems, but I think it's a good exercise to at least face real data and try to see what we can do with it. So thank you again, Dan and Amir. Hopefully we'll see you again toward the end of the week. And the next talk is Chris.
Hey, thank you.
And
Thanks.
you want to introduce Chris, or just say Chris and that's it?
Professor Chris Wade from Oxford.
Yeah.
We are very, very happy that you arrived yesterday and the line ended at the end.
Yeah, I got here, which is great. Yeah, and thank you for the first speakers. It's a very interesting talk. I actually just picked up a couple of comments on the first talk, which is, so I think that like the comment about the statistical operating characteristics of the test is really important. But the other piece that comes in is the decision part, which is the consequences of taking the two actions. Yeah, and what we see is if we've got an asymmetric loss. Yeah. So if acting on a false positive is worse than acting on a false negative, you need to take that into account. And we know how to do that with shift the decision boundary. And the other, I think, really interesting part, which is particularly in the US, there's a caution due to litigation, because it's not just what is optimal, unfortunately, for the patient, but the physicians are protecting themselves. Yeah? And we see that actually in the US in a lot of cancer treatments, is that comparative to the UK, so I sit on the National Health Service AI evaluation panel, comparative to the UK, clinicians in the US take quite aggressive cancer, late-stage cancer strategies, and part of that is because of litigation, that you could have treated the patient. So just a couple of things.
Defensive medicine.
Yes, that's a great, yeah.
And I didn't introduce Andrew, sorry, I didn't introduce
sorry.
you in this section as well, so Andrew is...
Oh, yeah, I guess Crystal.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Sorry, so anyhow, that was just a couple of things I wanted to pick up on. So, yeah, delighted to be here. I'm Chris Holmes. I'm Professor of Biostatistics at the University of Oxford. I'm also Programme Director for Health at the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, which is the UK's National Institute for AI and Data Science. And Andrew here, who's going to be helping today, is a postdoctoral researcher in my group at Oxford. And what we're going to talk today, or what we're going to cover today, is something called causal inference. And we could spend a whole week on causal inference, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for you, we're only going to have a short time. So what we want to do is we want to get across the essentials. There's be a bit of mathematics in there, get your brains kind of thinking about the foundations really of causal inference, what it means to talk about what does it mean to make a causal statement. And then in the second part, so Andrew's going to cover the foundations, and in the second part I'm going to pick up on an interesting new approach to thinking about causal inference in observational studies called target trial emulation, that has become very popular over the last few years. And we're going to take a particular angle on that, showing how you can think about causal inference through simulation. Yeah, so our kind of the central hypothesis will be, if you can accurately simulate a system, build a computer model that can accurately simulate a system, then you can do causal inference without drawing a lot of the kind of baggage that comes with some of the foundational approaches in causal inference. So first of all, I just want to kind of get across, why should you, people interested in AI in healthcare, be interested in causal inference? Yeah? And the key part is that when you perform a statistical analysis, so you've got some data, you build a regression model, you build a classification model, what does that tell you? It tells you about statistical associations, and what that means is it tells you about dependencies if you do not intervene in the world. Yeah, and that is the really key concept. So imagine you're in space, looking down on Israel, and you're gathering data about people taking tests, people have symptoms, people have outcomes, and you can build classification models, predictive models. And what they tell you is that if you sit back and you continue to monitor the population, but you do not intervene, those are predictive. So it will be kind of accurate in terms of uncertainty quantifications of what might happen. but it's no intervention. Yeah? By definition, almost, healthcare is about intervention. Yeah? The whole of healthcare is about intervention. You're born, yeah? Healthcare is about how can we take interventions, maybe preventative interventions. You shouldn't eat this. You should be eating more of this. You should be exercising. Yeah? Or on symptoms when you get sick, we need to intervene. How can we make deliberate actions through your life to improve your well-being, as well as to improve your health when you're sick? And so the basis of medical science is about interventions, and statistical analysis will not help you answer those questions. Yeah? If you want to answer what-if questions, which is coming down from space and saying, well, actually we think you should exercise more. Yeah, or we think there's a new compound that's available to help prevent this or to treat this condition. Those questions are causal questions. And they're much harder to answer. Yeah, and they can trip you up unless you're very careful. You take a data set, you analyze it, and it's not easy. Yeah, there are many kind of little tripwires in the analysis when you move from the observational to the causal. And so over the course of this morning, what we hope to do is, first of all, get you to start to think in a causal way, and then link this in with this idea of simulation can really help you in causal analysis. Thank you. And with that, I'll pass over to Andrew to take us through some of the foundations in causal. Are there any questions at this moment? Great. Thank you.
That's great. So hi everyone, I'm Andrew. Oh, yeah. So yeah, as Chris says, I'm going to give a very brief crash course to a couple of fundamental concepts in causal inference. So I'm going to start off by just kind of re-emphasizing some of the points that Chris just made. So this is a plot that came from a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years back. So I don't know if you can see, but on the x-axis what we have is chocolate consumption by kilograms per year per capita. And on the y-axis we have Nobel Prize laureates per 10 million population. So each flag represents a different country. So I think you can see immediately what this plot is trying to get at is that the more chocolate you eat, apparently, the more Nobel Prize winners you get in your country. So obviously, I think everyone here is going to be a little bit skeptical of making that conclusion straight away. But of course, some people jump to the conclusion that, okay, well, if you eat more chocolate, then you also get more Nobel Prize winners. And this came from confectionerynews.com, so they're perhaps not the most impartial source out there. But of course, this is as Chris was mentioning before, this is an example of a causal headline, right? Because it's not just saying, oh, here's a nice plot with a beautiful positive correlation. It's saying, if we actually implement this in policy, make our children eat more chocolate, maybe they'll be smarter or something like that, then we get different results. And this is exactly what we're interested in things like medicine, as Chris just explained beautifully then. So in order to kind of separate this idea of association from causation, we need a bit more than what we usually have in the kind of statistics and machine learning toolbox. So you've probably heard this motto before, or some form of it: association is not causation, or correlation does not imply causation, something like that.
I think it's stronger than that. I think many people are kind of afraid of making causal statements.
Precisely, yes, and we'll get to that as well. There's a kind of stigma attached. Some people call it the C word, causation, right? Not the only C word, but it's some people find it just as offensive. But so what we have in statistical machine learning are these concepts like regression, prediction, classification, the likelihood, p-values, confidence interval. You've heard of these. They're all purely associational concepts. So if we only talk in this language here, using these terms, the best we can get is association. So as Chris said, if we want to go beyond that, we need a new language and we need new terminology. And particularly in something like medicine, we're never really interested in just association without causation. Right? We're always thinking about some kind of intervention we want to make people's lives better, to increase their life expectancy, to give them better quality of life. Okay, so to give you another example, there was a plot that was circulated on Twitter a few years back This is data from the British ONS, that's the Office of National Statistics. So they had some data and somebody made a plot. And what you have in the orange curve here, the red curve, is the all-cause mortality for people between the ages of 10 to 59 after they received the second COVID vaccine. And what you have in the blue curve is the same all-cause mortality curve, but for people who weren't vaccinated. So what it seems to suggest is that if you get vaccinated twice, you actually increase your risk of mortality. So can everybody spot what might be going on here?
Not everybody in this age got vaccinated. It was only for very sick people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's an age element here, right? So if you're more vulnerable, and usually that also means if you're kind of older, then you're more likely to receive the vaccine, right? That also means that your all-cause mortality risk is generally high anyway. So we're not actually comparing like for like when we
Especially during those days.
Exactly. Yeah, right. This is kind of early days when COVID was still a much more serious thing, right? So somebody got in touch with the ONS, and then they produced a new plot. And what's going on here is that they're not just comparing unvaccinated and vaccinated; they're comparing within age groups, right? So now we're stratifying within age groups. So we look at the you look at this red solid curve here. That is unvaccinated for 50 to 59. And then we should be comparing to vaccinated for 50 to 59. So that's the same age group. And now we see a big difference, right? But the effect has now changed sign. So now the unvaccinated have a much higher risk than those who are vaccinated. And it's similar if you look at these dashed curves here. So the red dashed curve has a higher risk than the blue dashed curve. And again, we're comparing 18 to 39, so we're comparing like to like. Okay, but what's to differentiate this plot from the previous plot if we only talk in terms of association? There's nothing, right? So this is something called Simpson paradox. The fact that you can condition on additional variables, but you can flip the sign of your effect. If we only talk about in terms of association, there's nothing to say that this plot is more accurate than the previous plot. So in order to say this is the right way of looking at things, we need to talk about causation. Does that make sense? Okay, so how do we do causal inference? Fortunately, there's one way that everybody agrees on, and you've heard of it before. We do a randomized experiment. And this goes back to a very prominent statistician called Ronald Fisher. And he invented this idea when he was working at this agricultural research center in Britain called Rothamsted. The idea is that they had loads of this agricultural data and they wanted him to analyze it. He got there, realized they were doing the experiments all wrong, and ended up designing the experiments for them. So to illustrate the idea of a randomized experiment, this is an example that Fisher gave while he was working there at Rothamsted. So they were at tea break one day, and Fisher offered a cup of tea to a female colleague who was also working at Rothamsted, and she declined, seeing that he had poured the tea in first and the milk in second, and she preferred it when the milk had been poured in first and tea was added in second. And Fisher totally did not believe her. Like, there's no way he thought that there's, like, any human could tell the difference between a cup of tea that was made with milk first or a cup of tea made with tea first, right? And so he did what any good statistician does. He tested her. So there's a co-worker, William Roach, who's a biochemist working in the antiseptic insecticides lab. He overheard the conversation and said, okay, let's do the test. And then they proceeded to do the most British test in history. What they did was they mixed 8 cups of tea, 4 in one way and 4 in the other. So this is from Fisher's famous book, The Design Experiments. And then they presented them to the subject for judgment in a random order. And this is really important. The subject had been told in advance of what the test will consist, namely that she'll be asked to taste 8 cups, that these shall be 4 of each kind, so 4 with milk first and then tea second, and 4 in the other way. And that they shall be presented to her in a random order, that is an order not determined arbitrarily by human choice. So this is a novel aspect of what Fisher was doing. He was actually physically introducing randomness by doing things like drawing cards from a deck or flipping coins. Nowadays we would use the computer to do RNG. And her task is to then look at these 8 cups of tea, taste them, and then say which 4 were made in one way, in which well, the other 4 were made in another way. Okay, so nowadays, Fisher's test is often described using a concept called potential outcomes. So I'm just going to briefly go through what this is, and this is going to be a recurring theme.
You left us hanging, so what was the result?
Oh, I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. But I'm going to describe. I'm going to describe it. Yeah, I'm going to keep you waiting for a little bit. So, okay, the idea is, so we have some kind of outcome Y that we're interested in. So in this case, for this T, we're thinking about, okay, what does she guess, right? Is it milk first or is it T first? And then we have a treatment. So in this case, treatment is going to be, is it T first or is it milk first? And then we're going to split this outcome into 2 variables, right? One for each treatment variable. So we're going to have Y1 and Y0, right? So this was first thought about in terms of kind of agricultural research. So we'll be thinking about, like, is fertilizer used on a particular field, or is fertilizer not used on a particular field? And the idea is that this potential outcome is the outcome that would be observed if, even if we don't actually observe it, the subject receives that particular treatment. Okay, so that means if we have treatment value 1, then we observe Y1. So that's equal to the outcome. And if we observe T equals 0, then we observe Y0 and we don't observe Y1. Does that kind of make sense?
I think in modern lingo you call it the revolving door.
Yeah. So you can think about it as like you have Y1 and Y0 kind of like these prizes behind 2 doors, right? And you can only pick one of them. Once you open one of the doors, then you don't get to see another one, right? You're just left with one of the prizes. You can't have both. That's one way of thinking about it. Okay, right, let's come back to this then. So, as I said, Y is going to be the outcome. That's what she's going to guess. So either she's going to guess milk first, in which case Y equals 1, or she gets T first and then Y equals 0. And then the treatment is going to be the way that the T was made. So either T equals 1, and then T was made with milk first, and then T equals 0 if it was the other way around. And that means that if T equals 1, then we get to see the outcome if she for Y1, but we don't get to see Y0. And if T was 0, then we get to see Y0, but we don't get to see Y1. Does that make sense?
But they don't necessarily agree.
They don't necessarily agree. Yeah. That's what we're trying to test. Yeah. We're trying to see if they agree. Yeah. Okay. And so what we're really trying to test is a particular null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is basically saying she doesn't have a clue, right? She's just kind of guessing at random. And that would mean that no matter how the cup of tea was made, she would be guessing the same way. So that means that the potential outcome, Y1 equals Y0 for every instance here. Okay, that's our null hypothesis. So under this null hypothesis, we've gone from a table with missing data to a table now with full data, right? Because since before we had these question marks here, we can now fill in those points because we're saying under the null, these things are equal. So now these rows match. Okay, so, and then under this null hypothesis, what is the probability that she guesses all cups correctly? So we're going to set our test statistic to be the number of correct guesses out of 8. And then the probability of guessing all cups correctly under this null is not hard to show that there's going to be 1 over this 8 choose 4. Basically, there's an intuitive reason for why it's 8 choose 4. You have 8 cups of tea. If she's guessing at random, then she just chooses 4 of these cups to be milk first. And there's only one scenario where she happens to get all of them correct. So it's going to be 1 over 8 choose 4.
So the null includes also the random guess hypothesis?
Yeah, so it's basically, this is kind of the way of kind of conceptualizing it, that she's kind of, okay, she can't differentiate, then basically it's like guessing at random. Due to, okay, well, each one is kind of equally likely. So this then suggests why Fisher chose 8 cups, because if he only used 6 cups, then it goes from 8 choose 4 to 6 choose 3, that's just 20. But Fisher has this kind of famous 5% significance level, he's the guy who did that. So he wants something that's less than 5%, so he goes from 6 to 8 cups. And here's the moment you've been waiting for. She did guess all cups correctly. And in fact, she also got married to Fisher's co-experimenter, so that's a happily ever after story. Okay, so Hopefully I've kind of given you some kind of justification for why we use randomization when it comes to experiments. When Fisher first came up with this idea, it was actually very controversial. A lot of statisticians didn't like the idea of actually introducing noise into your experiment. But the way that Fisher justified it was that experimentation is like this game you're playing against an opponent, right? And in this case, the opponent would be like the laws of nature, say, right? And if you randomize, you guarantee that it doesn't matter how your adversary tries to conspire against you, you can always guarantee that at least on average, your groups that you're trying to compare are going to be balanced, right? So if you're, for example, you're thinking about kind of agricultural research that he was looking at, you could think, okay, well, I'm going to use fertilizer on this field, but not fertilizer on another field. How do I know that maybe the soil was different on the two different fields? Right, but if I randomize, then at least on average, I know nothing like that's going to be the case. So Bradford Hill was a very famous epidemiologist, and he describes it like this. Having used a random allocation, the sternest critic is unable to say, when we eventually dash into print, that quite probably the groups were differentially biased through our predilections or through our stupidity. So somewhat verbose, but that's kind of the idea of it, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a pesky editor or reviewer who isn't convinced by your results. So you say, well, I've actually randomized, then you can't really say anything against me. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that we can do causal inference if we have randomized experiments. But that's not the end of the story, because we can't always do randomized experiments. They might not be ethical, they might be too expensive, and they might be impractical. So a famous example is the link between smoking and lung cancer. So this is something that we kind of take for granted now, that smoking causes lung cancer. But to date, we've never had a randomized experiment that definitively proves that smoking causes lung cancer. All we have is non-randomized data. And so that's an example of a question that is really important, and we can't run a randomized experiment to try and answer it. So there are lots of questions out there where this is also true. And there's this quote by Miguel Hernan, another very prominent epidemiologist, who says, okay, this editor told me your observational study cannot prove causation. Please replace all references to causal effects by references to associations. But as Chris mentioned, if we're working with medicine, then it's really important to actually talk about causation, right? When are we interested in associations and not causation? So the best we can do is to use observational data, and we have to do it. Okay, so then we come to using non-randomized data, and the pioneer in this field was Don Rubin, who's a very prominent American statistician. And in the 1970s, he introduced a causal framework, which is now named after him, the Rubin causal model, which extended this idea of potential outcomes to observational data. And his philosophy was, well, okay, if we don't have randomized data, then what we should do is to use our observational data to try and emulate a randomized experiment, right? So obviously, ideally, you use a randomized experiment. If you don't, then you should try and kind of use your data you have, try and emulate it as best as possible. Okay, so I'm going to have to introduce a little bit of notation here, but this is kind of similar to what we had before. So we're going to have three variables here. First, we have y is the outcome variable. We've seen that already. And then I'm going to use this kind of running example of that COVID example I had right at the beginning. Right? So we think outcome is the all-cause mortality, and then T is the treatment assignment. So we're thinking the kind of COVID vaccine assignment. And then X is some covariance that we also have. So in this case, we think about the age. We're talking about stratifying on age to adjust for confounding. Okay. So this is, again, kind of revisiting the idea that we can kind of split our outcome into two variables, right? So we go from outcome y, and we split it into y1 and y0. And to do this, implicitly, there are two assumptions. The first, this assumption is called SUTFA, or the stable unit treatment value assumption. The first assumption is that there's no interference. So it means that the treatment that you get has no effect on my outcome. So that's not necessarily true. We're talking about contagious disease like COVID, but for simplicity, we'll assume this is true. The second assumption is that there are no hidden variations of treatment. So this is also perhaps not entirely realistic, because you could say, well, if I got my treatment from hospital A, then it might not be the same as getting treatment from hospital B. But again, we're going to make this kind of simplifying assumption to be able to do inference. Okay, and so we're going back to this idea of missing data again. So under this assumption, then we can write our data in terms of this missing data table, right? So if we have t equals 1, then again we see y1, and we don't get to see y0. And if we have t equals 0, then we do get to see y0, but we don't get to see y1. Okay? So it's important to kind of think that from Rubin's perspective, y1 and y0 do both exist. And also, yeah, this idea of kind of like these two doors, or in his perspective, he has a kind of physics interpretation because that was his background. So he was thinking in terms of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that you could kind of measure the position of a particle or the momentum of a particle, but you can't measure both precisely. So he kind of used that as an analogy for this, so that you can kind of measure y1, but then you don't get to see y0, or you can measure y0, but you don't get to see y1. Okay. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so here's this assumption now is a bit trickier. So this is something called unconfoundedness. And what it says is that our treatment assignment variable t is assumed to be conditionally independent of the two potential outcomes given x. And so equivalently, we can say the probability of t given y1, y0, and x is equal to just the probability of t given x. And sometimes this is called ignorability or conditional exchangeability. So this is an assumption that's often misunderstood when people first see it. It's important to note it doesn't mean that the treatment is conditionally independent of the outcomes. Obviously, that'd be nonsense, because we're actually trying to find out the effect of the treatment on the outcomes. But what it's saying instead is T is the treatment assignment. So that's the decision that, say, a doctor makes to assign treatment. And Y1 and Y0 are the potential outcomes rather than the observed outcome. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. And I think the easiest way to try and interpret this assumption is that we basically have these mini randomized trials within each level of X. So it's like, okay, if I know your age, then your treatment assignment is basically like assigned using a flip of a coin. So for each value of X, it's like we have a randomized experiment.
So could you say that if things were ordered temporarily, this and T comes before the embodiment or the choice of Y1 and 0, Y0, then you would naturally have that. So if things are temporarily ordered, I guess you're going to get that with Carl in a second. But
Yeah.
But if we're talking about treatment for disease and then what happened to the patient, then the temporal order kind of makes the physician didn't see what the treatment did.
Yes. That would be one way. That would be one way of satisfying. Yeah, that we kind of separate the decision that the physician made from the outcome. Yeah, absolutely.
When that's not applied.
When is that not true? So we think back to that example I had at the beginning, when I was talking about the vaccines, right? So when I was saying, okay, you have the all-cause mortality, but we're separating it from kind of treated and vaccinated and non-vaccinated. Let's say in that case we don't have X, so X is just empty, right? Then in that case you don't have this kind of issue. Oh, so you do have this issue, right? They're not balanced.
But the question is whether you have the full picture in X.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you were just to compare vaccinated and unvaccinated without thinking about age, so X is just empty here, we're just thinking about the independence rather than conditional independence, then basically we don't have this kind of mini randomized trial idea, right? Because if you're, say, in the 50 to 59 range, you're more likely to receive vaccination than if you're in the 18 to 30 range. Yeah.
So what you're actually saying, if X was gender, maybe not gender, eating chocolate or not, and these kind of things that are irrelevant, then the intervention is linked to a variable that we don't see that is related to the outcome, and therefore this condition does not apply.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You get these spurious correlations from things that just don't matter. So X needs to include all the things that are involved in the decision making, aside from the outcome itself.
Yeah, but you had in the previous slide this condition or assumption that you have all the available data.
Yeah.
So is there a case where you have all the relevant data and you still, this condition does not hold?
Well, as long as X, essentially, if X includes all the information you had before you made the decision, then usually that would kind of guarantee it. But I'm going to give an example later on, actually related to Judeo-Poll, as was alluded to, where that might not be the case. So we need to think carefully about how we choose X. So I'm going to talk about that later.
I think, Andrew, just to say to everybody, I think this is one of the hardest things to get your head around in causal inference, this idea of unconfoundedness, because on the face of it, as Andrew points out, it seems nonsensical that the treatment is independent of the outcome. Yeah, it's like, how can that be? But the way to think, like as Andrew said, in Rubin's world, those outcomes exist. Yeah, he separates out this idea of the science. So, you know, whether you take a paracetamol or not, the outcome after you've taken that paracetamol or after you've not taken that paracetamol are somehow fixed. Yeah, so the Y1 and the Y0 are just given, they exist. Yeah. By taking the paracetamol or not taking the paracetamol, the only thing that does is reveal which one of those variables you get to see. Yeah, not the actual values themselves. So this treatment allocation is purely about which one of these variables you're going to reveal. If I treat the patient or I don't treat the patient, I'm going to reveal a trajectory, one path in that patient's medical future. Yeah? And this thing here says I need to gather enough information, enough covariates, such that when I look at the observational data, where I haven't read the treatment allocation, some patients did take paracetamol, some patients didn't. The choice that they made looks random at that level of X.
But the thing, just to continue on that, this by itself is not testable. We cannot go to our data and say, oh, it's independent.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So this is kind of the most controversial assumption, because we're basically saying we have observational data, but we essentially have data that's good enough to be a randomized experiment. We're kind of saying. You kind of say conditional on X, we have a randomized experiment, but you can't test that using observational data, because if you could, then you have a randomized experiment. So this is something you have to think very carefully about, and you have to justify it very meticulously to get across the idea that you are doing causal inference.
Can you comment about the approach of Mendelian randomization in order to verify you have?
Yeah, that's something that we're not going to touch upon too much in this. It's something called instrumental variable estimation. So that is when you don't have this assumption, basically.
It's an alternative way.
An alternative way of doing it. So you say, okay, I can't satisfy this assumption because I don't have a rich enough set of X. So I'm going to use something else, like a gene, for example, which is essentially randomized, or we're going to assume it's randomized. So it's something called instrumental variables, which unfortunately is kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing today, but at some point, yeah.
So let's continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So yeah, basically this is a kind of visual representation of what Chris was just talking about. So these contours here represent the kind of joint probability distribution of the two potential outcomes. And these points are particular values of the potential outcomes. And as Chris was saying, well, we don't see the whole 2D picture here. We don't get this bird's eye view. Instead, we just see the values projected onto one of the axes. So we see one of the coordinates. And if it's projected on this side, it's going to be in red. And if it's projected upwards, it's going to be in green. And so effectively, what that assumption is saying is that the color of these dots is independent of the position of the dot. Right? The color represents the treatment, the position of the dot represents the value of the potential outcomes. So it doesn't matter which way we go about it, the color we get is going to be independent of the values of the potential outcomes. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is an important concept for Rubin. So if we have this unconfoundedness assumption, we can take our joint distribution of the data and we can write it in this form here. So first we have t given x, and then we have this vector y1, y0, and x. And that vector is what Rubin calls the signs, right? So y1, y0, and x, that's what we're actually interested in learning about, right? That's the covariates and the outcomes, right? Whereas the t given x, that is the design of the experiment. And we don't really care about it. That is a human choice in terms of how we try and uncover the science. So to Rubin, it's really important to kind of separate these things because the science is kind of invariant. It doesn't matter how we try and find out about it. It's just going to be out there in nature. Whereas the design of the experiment is something that we choose. And so with this assumption, you can separate these two things. And then one more assumption, and this is relatively simple. It's called overlap or positivity. And really what it means is that basically every individual has a strictly positive probability of receiving either treatment, right? So if doctors are assigning a particular treatment, you have to make sure that they have some positive probability of assigning treatment to anybody. So this would be violated, for example, if a doctor always assigns a particular treatment to patients who are critically ill. In that case, you never see what happens if the critically ill patient doesn't receive the treatment. In that case, it's trouble when we come to causal inference because then we can't compare what happens with and without treatment for those who are critically ill. And so if then we wanted to do causal inference, we would have to extrapolate from the people who did receive both treatments to kind of find out what the effect is for those who are ill. Okay, and then I won't go through this in too much detail, but basically if you have these assumptions, you can do something called identification. So you can write an estimand, the average causal effect here, which is the difference in the means of the two potential outcomes. You go from these counterfactual quantities to a quantity that only depends on the observed data. So what we have on the left-hand side, there is the expectation of y1. That's a counterfactual quantity. But what you have on the right-hand side at the bottom is something that only involves things that we actually observe in the real data. So we've kind of linked this interventional world with the kind of observational world. And this is something called the G formula, but that's just kind of semantics. The important thing to note here is that what we have up here is not the same as what we have down here, right? So up here, we're kind of intervening on treatment. We're kind of forcing treatment on someone. And down here, we're kind of conditioning on treatment. So we're just observing treatment. So doing and intervening is not the same as just observing. Okay, and that's really kind of mathematical encapsulation of this idea that association is not causation, at least not in general. Yeah, questions? Yeah, go on.
About the overlap,
yeah.
There is a trade-off between the unconfoundedness to the overlap, right? If the dimension of x is really large, so the probability to have this set of features is really low, right?
Do you mean like if you have more information in your x, then you're going to have kind of less positivity?
Yes.
Yeah, more stratification, you get less overlap.
Even x will be
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So you could say, well, if a doctor has kind of all the information they need, they would have basically a more sure decision about whether to assign treatment or not. And therefore, it makes it less likely that overlap is satisfied.
Yeah, so do you have a comment about it? What are you doing in practice?
Yeah, so this is something that I guess kind of frustrates statisticians, which is that they would say, okay, even if that were the case, then basically you always should do some kind of randomness if you want to learn about causality. Because if you're very kind of dogmatic about saying these patients should always receive treatment, then you never learn about what happens if the patients don't receive treatment. And you're not learning that way. You say, okay, from my intuition it's better, but you're not actually getting the kind of statistics telling you that it's better. Maybe there are kind of some special cases that you don't find out about because you're so sure about it.
Just on that specific point, we have a paper from our group in Oxford that used, we're very interested in this high-dimensional causal inference, and one of the interesting things now is that we can increasingly measure people using wearables, electronic health records, so X is just getting bigger and bigger, and as you quite rightly point out, if we need to find a strata such that things look random, that gets harder and harder, and what we showed is that you can use deep learning as a compression approach. So imagine you've got deep learning, which is you're taking very, very high dimensional inputs, and you're maybe building like something called an autoencoder or some way of somehow that takes those projections and then maps them onto lower and lower dimensions and maybe then goes back out again. But if you take the innermost, the most compressed layer, if you can show that it's learning an accurate embedding, then it is valid, theoretically it's valid to match, to build those strata on the projections within a neural net. So that's one way you can think about that.
Okay, cool. Okay, there's a slight digression here, but this idea of kind of defining things in terms of estimands might not be familiar to everyone. It's something that's very commonly done in causal inference. So far, we haven't assumed any kind of statistical model or algorithm or anything like that. We're just saying, okay, here's what we're trying to estimate. And then once we've decided that, then we use models to try and estimate this thing. So this differs from the kind of classical way of doing statistics. So, yeah.
In this formula, we have average for y1 and average for 1, 0.
Yeah.
But at the previous slide, the treatment effect was average for y1 minus just y0. So what is the correct formula for treatment effect?
This should be the same as before. So y1 minus y0, is that?
No. You just had the two. Before you just had the left terms on both sides.
Oh, right. Sorry. So yeah. Sorry. I was kind of implicitly saying. So you could do y1, and then you could also do the same thing for y0, and then you combine the two things. So here, instead of t equals 1, you would swap that with t equals 0, and then you combine these two things, and you get that. Sorry, I kind of missed it. Yeah.
The previous slide,
Yeah.
on the previous slide, the treatment effect is correctly reached, accurately reached, or the treatment effect both average and
It was always average. Yeah, actually, there's something that is kind of a theme that will be also carried over to Chris's part of the talk, which is this idea that we're thinking about averages. Okay, yeah, so basically what I was saying is that the kind of classical way of doing statistics, we actually start with a statistical model, like say the Cox model, and then we define our estimands based on that, so like a hazard ratio or something like that. But that's a kind of different perspective, because if you just say do a Cox regression and it turns out your Cox model is not correct, then what you're trying to estimate then doesn't become causally relevant anymore. So what we do is that we start off by saying, okay, this is the causal estimand we're interested in, and then we're going to use models to try and estimate that as well as we can. Okay. And so this is kind of encapsulating the whole picture of what's going on, right? So what we're interested in is this interventional population over there on the left. That's where all the causal stuff lives. But unless you have a randomized trial, you don't get data from that population. Instead, we get data from this population. That's the observational population. And this is where we get data from. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get from this finite sample from an observational population and link it back to the interventional population. And so that's done in a two-stage process. We've been talking about identification so far, but of course also you need to do some statistical estimation using your favorite algorithms and models to learn about the observational population as well. Okay, so just to summarize what I've said so far, we want to find a kind of valid, rich set of covariance X that satisfies those assumptions like unconfoundedness and overlap. And then we have this formula which tells us how we identify the causal estimand. And then once we have that, we can then fit our favorite models to estimate the right-hand side. But then, this is alluded to earlier, how do we actually decide on x? How do we choose x? Right, so far I've just said we have an x that satisfies the assumptions. How do we actually select x so that these assumptions hold? And now we kind of move on to another pioneer of causal inference called Pearl. So Pearl is a computer scientist at UCLA, and he...
Just
yes.
was born in Israel.
Yes, he's, yes. And yes, he advocates a graphical approach to causality. So we're going to look at a lot of graphs. And basically, what's great about his approach is that it gives us very firm guidance on how we choose this x so, to adjust for confounding. So we're going to look at these kinds of graphs. These are often called Bayesian networks or directly cyclic graphs. The idea is that each node is going to represent some variable. And the direction of these arrows are going to represent the direction of causal effects. So basically, we have an arrow going from 2 to 5, kind of saying that 2 causes 5. That's a direct cause from 2 to 5. So I need to define some terminology. So a path is a sequence of distinct adjacent vertices. So we have a path going from 1 to 2 to 5 to 7. That would be a path because they're all linked together by arrows. And we say that a vertex is a descendant of another vertex if we have a path that has just unidirectional arrows going from one to the other. So, for example, that same path again, 1 to 2 to 5 to 7, that would suggest that 7 is a descendant of 1 because we have a path that only has these arrows going outwards, going from 1 to 7. And if we have just an adjacent link, so we have, say, 5 to 7, that means 5 is parent of 7. And so is 4. 4 is also a parent of 7. 6 is also a parent of 7.
So just a minor comment.
Yeah.
If this terminology comes from family trees, so think of 1 begot 2, 2 begot 5, and so on, then those terms will actually make sense.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. And then there's an important concept that's a little bit tricky to think about, but it's the idea of these vertices being blocked by a set. So we say that a path between two vertices is blocked by S if there's a node VK satisfying either we have one of these 3 patterns. So if we have the arrows going in the same direction, so VK minus 1 goes into VK and then goes into VK plus 1, that's called a chain. And similar if we have the other direction. Or the final pattern there is we have arrows going out of VK, so that we call that a fork. So VK has an arrow going to VK minus 1 and VK has an arrow going to VK plus 1. Or the exception is something called a collider, and that's when we have arrows going into each other. And in that case, either that happens and VK is not in S, and none of its descendants are also in S. So we're going to go through an example, so hopefully this will be made a bit clearer. So again, we're going back to this graph here. And my claim is that every path from 3 to 5 is blocked by 1. Okay? So the idea is that we're going to think about every path that goes from 3 to 5 and show that every path is blocked by 1. Okay? So first, if we think about any path that goes through 1, since 1 is in our set, and that is a fork path, that means any path going through 1 is going to be blocked. Okay, because a fork is one of those 3 patterns where we say it's going to be blocked. So we look at this path, go 3 to 4 to 2 to 5. In this case, 4 here is where we have the arrows going inwards. That's our collider pattern, that's our exception. In that case, 4 is not in our set, it's not in 1. And also its descendant 7 is also not in our set. So that means this path is also blocked by 1. Okay? And similarly, we have a path going 3 to 4 to 7 to 5. 7 is again a collider because we have these arrows going into it. And 7 is not in our set. And so this is blocked. And the same thing is true for any path that goes through 7. So any path going through 7 is going to have this kind of pattern of arrows going inwards, and so all of these paths are going to be blocked. Same for this one, and this one as well. And finally, we have this path here. So we go 3 to 6, to 4 to 2 to 5. And in this case, 6, again, has this pattern where we have 3 going into 6 and 4 goes into 6. So that's a collider. And 6 is not in our set. 7 is also not in our set, which is the descendant. And so this path is also blocked by 1. Okay. So that's blocking. So the reason that's important is because Judea Pearl came up with a very clever idea that allows us to use graphs to then decide when a set of variables is sufficient to adjust for confounding. And there are just 2 parts to this. So W satisfies the backdoor criterion if no node in W contains a descendant of T, and also W blocks all paths from T to Y entering through the back door. And through the back door means that is a path from T to Y where the first arrow starts going into T. So we're going to see some examples of this in a second.
So we have to assume the graph in order to check.
Exactly, yeah, that's a great point. So I'm going to show you some examples of graphs in a moment, and you're going to have to kind of trust that the graphs are kind of true. Okay, and so if this is true, we get back that formula that we had from before. That's the adjustment formula, the G formula that we were looking at previously. So before we were just saying, okay, if we have this X and it satisfies these assumptions, then we can estimate it. Here we're kind of giving a graphical criterion for choosing X. Well, in this here I said W. Okay, so here's an example. We're going back to that vaccine kind of Simpson's paradox idea from before. So we're saying that, okay, depending on your age, you're more or less likely to receive the vaccine. And we also say that age affects your risk of all-cause mortality. And we're trying to investigate whether the vaccine actually protects you against death. So in this case, we have one backdoor path. It's the one that goes through X. So we have this backdoor arrow going into T, so that makes a backdoor path. And to make this be blocked, we're going to have to condition on X. So this criterion is saying that we should condition for X, as we intuitively know. All right. So in this case, we should adjust for age. Here's another example. In this case, I've shaded the vertex for U because we've not observed it, and we're looking at the possible effect of coffee on causing cancer. Okay. So here we've also observed the smoking status of the individual, and the question is, do we need to adjust for smoking? And again, we have this backdoor path where U goes into T, and it suggests that if we want to block this backdoor path, we do need to condition on S. So what's interesting about this is that even though smoking doesn't have any kind of causal effect on drinking coffee, if we don't measure someone's addictive behavior, we can introduce spurious correlations because of that, right? So if they drink more coffee, they're more likely to have addictive behavior. That makes them more likely to smoke, and that makes them more likely to get cancer. So there's a link there. So we need to adjust for smoking. That's what this is saying, yeah.
This is exactly what's bothering me in this model, because the amount of missing nodes you have is only limited by your imagination.
It is. So this is the kind of art of doing causal inference, is that you really have to kind of argue very carefully that basically I've included everything that's relevant. And then you have to say, well, here's some things that people might think are relevant, and this is why we believe that it's not relevant, or we've included some kind of sensitivity analysis to say, okay, we've tried that as well, and it's basically the same. So that's the best we can do if we're looking at observational data, unfortunately.
But we have to remember that all models are wrong.
All models are wrong, and so some models are useful, hopefully. Okay, so here's another example. So we're saying, okay, we're looking at the effect of education on somebody's diabetes status, and we've also measured the mother's diabetes status, but we don't have information on their income during childhood, and we don't have information on their genetic risk. And so this is the kind of causal diagram that we've written down. So we're saying that income during childhood has a causal effect on the mother's diabetes as well as education, and the genetic risk of diabetes has a causal effect on the mother's diabetes and also the patient's diabetes. So in this case, let's apply the backdoor criterion. So we have one backdoor path that goes through M. But remember, M is again this colliding structure. So we have arrows going into M. So that means if we condition on M, then it actually opens up this path. It unblocks it. So in this case, actually, even though we have mother's diabetes as a pre-treatment covariate, the backdoor criterion is saying we shouldn't adjust for it, which is kind of unintuitive. So it's saying actually, even if you have that information, you shouldn't use it. And then the final kind of just, I don't think this example has ever come up in any kind of real scenario, but it's just kind of fun. So here we have two backdoor paths from T to Y. One that goes through M using through these unmeasured variables. So in this case, it's the same as the previous slide, because we have this colliding structure. It says that we shouldn't adjust for M. But at the same time, we also have this backdoor path, which goes through M, but not through U1 and U2. And here it says we should adjust for M. So we have two conflicting things. And in this case, we're stuffed. Basically, we can't proceed. It's saying that we have to adjust for M, but we also shouldn't adjust for M, and we're in trouble either way. Okay, so yeah, that comes to the conclusion of this brief crash course in causal inference. So the take-home message is we should think about our problems in terms of causal perspective, because we're interested in making decisions, and decisions is all about thinking about causal inference. The cornerstone of causal inference is running randomized experiments, but we can't always do that, and so we're going to have to use non-randomized data as well. And causal inference is a two-stage process. We have the identification part, which is linking the interventional population with the observational population, and then we have estimation, which is the things you're very familiar with, where you use your favorite models and algorithms to find estimates. And lastly, graphs, as pioneered by Judea Pearl, are a very helpful way of representing our causal assumptions, and also gives us tools to decide when we should include certain covariates into our analysis. Okay, any questions? Yes.
The difference between identification and estimation?
Yes.
Identification is by what variables I need to stratify.
But yeah.
Right?
But
That's,
yeah. It's kind of almost like pre-statistics. It's like
you're not removing patients, you're just dividing them into the right group.
Exactly. You say, I need to adjust for their age, I need to adjust for their gender, and things like that. That's kind of before we actually get into models or anything like that, yeah.
And the butterfly is an example where you cannot identify.
Yeah. There are lots of examples where we can't identify, unfortunately. So those are the kind of cases where you're going to have to argue with your collaborators or your reviewers or editors or so on that, there's just, the graph is the truth or something like it is the truth. And if not, then, yeah, you don't get published, unfortunately. Okay. Any further questions? Chris,
it might make sense, given the structure, that we take now the break and we come back later, whatever you want. Whatever makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's been a
so
big brain dump.
I will throw in another bit of information that, especially for our guests from abroad, there's going to be a demonstration. How do you call it? Demonstration at 12:30, just outside our window.
Okay.
So this is the student organization and the faculty against things the government is planning to do. This is an interesting story about democracies and civil rights, but it's really going to be just outside here, so it might get noisy at 12:30. So you might have to take that into account. What?
Yeah.
So I think we should try to maybe we are flexible.
I mean, if we're flexible with the time, what I suggest is why don't we take the break now, and we come back, and I can summarize, and let's field some questions. Let it kind of simmer in, and then let's take some questions on that first part, and then I can give a short lecture on the second part, which is about how we might start to kind of implement these things
on the computer.
And we can take the lunch break from 12:30 to 2, and then maybe...
Whatever
Hands-on
works.
that you said it's the last session, is that half an hour more or less?
Yeah, it's
yeah,
about
sure.
half an hour.
So we can do it at 2. And
After
then
lunch.
we split your, so you give, then you give your
Yeah.
piece after
Okay.
break,
Yeah.
lunch.
Yeah.
Another housekeeping, we obtained yesterday's slides from Dr. Shachar, and you can ask the school people how to get access. And we hope to get your slides too.
Yeah, I'm going to have a link to
I
it.
saw people taking photos. I mean, it's always nice to see.
Oh,
the
yes,
slides.
yeah,
exactly.
you'll have
Yes,
the slides.
we'll have, yeah, the slides will be available.
Just read the slide.
I asked her to create a folder, and then she would ask.
Yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much.
So what,
So-
will you meet back here?
So it's, how long is the break?
15 minutes.
So we meet here at 11:05, let's say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, if any